Do you want to know what it feels like having extroverted thinking as one of your top functions? It's like being in a world where you're one of the few adults and everyone is a child. I'm not saying that to be rude. I'm just using that as an example because I feel like everyone watching this video can relate to being an adult around a child, or at least a teenager around a child. You know the child's capabilities. You want the best for the child. You know that you will say things that will probably hurt the emotions of that child, but ultimately you hope that they will learn and grow from it. Regardless of how many times the child gives up or how many times they refuse to follow instructions or say that they can't do something, you won't give up on them and will guide them as much as needed. In a very simplified sense, that's how it feels to have extroverted thinking. TE users are some of the biggest cheerleaders, even if we don't express it in a very emotional way. We like to be there for people. So what exactly is extroverted thinking? In order to fully understand extroverted thinking, or TE for short, we have to understand how TE affects the user, because there's so much misunderstanding that leads to a lot of negative stereotypes. Primarily, I guess, the ESTJs and the ENTJs, both TE DOMs. TE DOMs tend to have a reputation of being bossy. But why are they bossy? Who says they're bossy? What does being bossy even mean? Are TE DOMs bossy, or is everyone else just lazy? But then what about those moments when low TE users, such as the INFP or ISFP, explodes and starts telling everyone what to do? Are they not bossy because they don't have extroverted thinking as one of their dominant function? And is it considered being bossy if they're making you do something that you specifically told them you wanted to do, but didn't do it without a nudge? Is that being bossy? Or is that being helpful? For clarity, I'll be using 4 different terms that represents different sets of people. When I use the term TE DOM, I'm referring only to the ESTJ and the ENTJ. When I use the term high TE user, I'm referring to the types that have extroverted thinking in their first or second stack. So the ESTJ, ENTJ, ISTJ, and the INTJ. When I use the term low TE user, I'm referring to the 4 types that have extroverted thinking in their third or fourth stack. So the ESFPs, ENFP, ISFP, and INFP. Lastly, when I use the term TE user, I'm referring to everyone I just mentioned. Another TE misunderstanding is that if a person's able to stick to a schedule, then that person must have extroverted thinking. But with that logic, that means that a TI user should never be able to stick to a schedule. That means that a TI user is doomed to only be successful as a one-hit wonder. That also means that most TI users will be out of a job because they shouldn't be able to consistently make it to their 9-to-5 job because it's a daily routine. We all know that's not true. The final misunderstanding about extroverted thinking that I want to go over is that it's selfish, because having extroverted thinking means that the user have introverted feeling, or FI, and FI is known to be selfish. What tends to be ignored is that extroverted thinking is a people function. Not all, but a lot of reasons why TE users are so productive is because there's a people aspect to it. Not only are TE users more productive if they're spectators or people relying on them, but a lot of results that TE is trying to produce tends to benefit people or the tribe. So then what exactly is extroverted thinking? TE is both extroverted and a judging function, which is very important. Extroverted means that the focus is on something external to the user, and judging is an objective function that makes an opinion for what things really are objectively, as opposed to an introverted function, which is more directed inward, or a perceiving function such as introverted intuition or introverted sensing, which is more of a self-interpretation of the real world. That's all you need to know about the difference to understand the rest of this video. Extroverted thinking can be summarized with one word, and that word isn't efficiency, because efficiency is the result of having extroverted thinking. Extroverted thinking can be summarized using the word systems. To a high TE user, everything in the world belongs to a system, and everything that you see or hear from a TE user relates back to the system. Systems are everywhere. Systems are always evolving, and most systems are interconnected. They're found in the sensory world, such as in nature, social dynamics such as politics, and emotional dynamics such as parenting style or love languages. As a result, some of these words are commonly used to describe systems, such as efficiency, timeline, resource, emotional attitudes, metrics, structure, communication style, emotional intelligence, capabilities, superpower, and a bunch more. Extroverted thinking sounds very corporate because it's very systematic, which is typically the future of a successful business. You know a business is doing well if they start interpreting extroverted thinking habits. That's why high TE users tend to climb the corporate ladder easier than their TI counterpart, because it's common sense for a TE user to think the way the company wants us to think. As a result of having a high TE, users are able to accurately see so many different systems. We're also able to see why systems will work or fail. Extroverted thinking understands what input is needed to produce a certain output, because both thinking functions, both the introverted and extroverted function, is based off data or logic. Here's a quick example. In order to bake a pumpkin pie, I need pumpkin or pumpkin flavoring, because the pie will have a different taste if all the flavoring I have doesn't produce pumpkin flavor. Or if I want to bake a pumpkin pie and only have cherry or cherry flavoring, then it's only logical to produce a cherry flavored pie. A pumpkin pie can't be made unless we have pumpkin flavoring. That's logic. It's logic because it can continuously be replicated and produce the same result. Here's the most basic example. 1 plus 1 equals 2. 1 plus 1 can't produce anything else besides 2. That's the simplest way to explain logic. Since extroverted thinking is an extroverted function, high TE users typically have an opinion on just about everything. Everything is essentially its own system. But because thinking is based off logic, what tends to be ignored is that extroverted thinking is mostly impartial on opinions, which also means that they're just as receptive to feedback or new ideas. Their opinions can be changed if enough data is presented to go against their original stance. Since the thinking functions are based off logic, there tends not to be any underlying meaning or hidden message unless introverted feeling sneaks in, but we'll address introverted feeling later. But even with that said, not all feedback are weighted the same. Extroverted thinking respects authority or experts. It doesn't make sense for us to incorporate feedback for people who don't have the proper education or experience on the topic. We'll listen to be polite, but we'll most likely discard it. High TE users are so cognizant of our own strengths and weaknesses, it's easy to tell if someone knows something more than we do or if they're an expert. We're also so aware of the functionality of a system that it's easy to tell if a so-called expert knows what they're talking about, or if they're just a person full of shit. As an example of people full of shit, 90% of finance gurus that you find online. Because why would they put something out for free if they're not a millionaire themselves, but they can become one if they follow their own set of rules? That doesn't make logical sense. The last thing I want to mention about extroverted thinking before I go into comparison against the other functions is that extroverted thinking standards are based off the standards of the tribe or the tribe that extroverted thinking user associates with. So it's not necessarily who the TE user grows up with, but who's part of their FI value. Therefore, success for a TE user is going to differ. Not all TE users want to be a CEO of a company, but all TE users tend to want to be the best at whatever their vision of success is. If the tribe doesn't care about wealth and instead puts an importance on family, then the high TE user may focus their energy on family. Or if the tribe values financial freedom or stability, then the TE user might become the CEO stereotype the community is accustomed to. Now that we have a basic understanding of extroverted thinking, let's provide more clarity as to how to spot it and how it looks when compared to other functions, because it does engage the user and other people differently. Let's start with a comparison between extroverted thinking and introverted feeling. If a type has TE in their function, that means that they automatically have FI somewhere in the stack as well. TE and FI acts like an internal check and balance where TE knows how to get shit done and FI makes sure to maintain ethics. But ethics in an FI sense. So what's ethical to the person might not align with societal standards. The reason why both functions are important to understand is because if the TE user didn't have FI, then they will focus purely on beating the system and hence become the evil overlord that take over companies that do all these unethical issues such as BP oil or something. FI acts as a value system for the TE user regardless of where it places on the function stack. FI reminds the TE user that at the end of the day, we're still human. The higher extroverted thinking is on the stack, the more likely the user is to be a workaholic, because they'll see problems in systems easily and will have the natural urge to fix it regardless of whether it aligns with our FI value or not. As a result, high TE users tend to constantly be working on a project because it feels natural or common sense. Some of them even have a habit of working while being on vacation because it doesn't really feel like work to them. But for the rest of us, secondary TE users included, Bro, you TE DOMs, you guys are doing too much when you do that. On the other hand, the higher FIs on the function stack, the more ethics and internal values are considered before TE is engaged, which leads to paralysis when engaging with the world, the higher FIs in the function stack, because the user is less likely to work on a project if the action doesn't match their FI value. High FI users have to be passionate about something to work effectively on a project, whereas a high TE user will be effective simply for the fact that things need to get done. Having introverted feeling lower in the stack also means that emotional connection is less important for high TE users compared to most MBTI types. But that doesn't mean we don't care. Having low FI means that the high TE user have a more difficult time making genuine connections because it's not a priority to us, which usually leads to ENTJs or ESTJs looking like introverts because it doesn't match the typical big group of friends stereotype of an extrovert. It can happen, sure, but it typically doesn't turn out that way. Something that's commonly overlooked about TE DOMs is that they tend to be more quiet around people that they're unfamiliar with if they don't fully understand the system that they're in at that moment, where they fit into that system, or where the strangers fit into that system. But the moment those questions are answered, the TE user could talk their ear off because TE loves to talk. A result of having low emotional connection is a high level of loyalty. It's difficult for low FI users to expose our emotional side, so the moment we decide that you're safe, girl, you've acquired a special place in our heart. Not everyone gets there. So the small group that does will defend until our bones break. The love language for a high TE user is fixing external world problems and providing advice on how to improve systems for our loved ones. We can also be that, let's say, lovey-dovey things, but those occasions are more rare than us showing love in a more practical way, like fixing your bike if it's broken or improving the bike to make sure you're more comfortable while riding it. Sometimes this leads to high TE users coming off as bossy, whiny, or having too much complaints to our loved ones. What most people are unaware of is that high TE users won't do this unless you are important to us. Because if the person isn't important to us, then it feels like a waste of time. It's easy to see if we don't like someone because we're not afraid to show it and we'll avoid that person. So we're vocal when we believe it's necessary to improve the life of those around us or the people that we believe are in our circle. High TE users also believe in leading by example. We enjoy motivating others by showing what's possible with enough grit and determination. However, this is a double-edged sword because it could come off as bragging, which, let's be honest, it is sometimes. TE users will vocally tell other people what we accomplish, not only to inspire others, but also because we're proud of it. There's an FI component to it. And that component is because it feels good to be noticed for the things that we accomplish, especially if the result is helping someone we care about or improving the lives of those in our social circle, those of the tribe. The last thing that I think is important to understand about having low FI is that it allows the user to pick and choose when to feel emotions. This is pretty common with all thinking types. The high TE users are able to backlog emotions if we believe that it won't improve the situation or we believe that it will make the situation worse. What this also means is that we get to choose when and where we decide to show emotions, such as empathy. If we believe that empathy isn't necessary, such as when the reason for the other person is upset doesn't make logical sense, we can decide to have impartial emotions or just choose not to care at all. After learning MBTI and talking to feelers, I once thought this was a hindrance since we can seem cold or robotic, but now I realize it's a superpower. High TE users are able to accomplish more because we have the ability to ignore emotions, especially during time of high stress. We don't have to deal with our emotions at that moment. That's pretty crazy. The next comparison that we need to understand is the difference between extroverted thinking and introverted thinking, TE and TI. A simplified explanation of the difference is that TI wants to be the most accurate when understanding the system or logic behind the system, and TE just wants to be accurate enough to begin working on the system. To a TE user, being able to fix the problem or work on the system quickly is more important than fixing the problem optimally, although we're still going to try when we're working on it. High TE users are okay with failing, but we fail fast because that allows us to fix more problems or work on more systems. As a result, a lot of the times we're aware that we don't have all the answers, but we feel like we have enough answers to work on whatever job that we're trying to fix. Or sometimes we outsource our understanding to someone else, such as an expert in the field or someone we know that knows more than us. That's why when a TE user is explaining a concept, they usually reference something external to themselves or ourselves, such as an article, a study conducted by an expert, the name of a scientist or an artist, or the name of an author. But I'm not going to do this video because I don't want to cite my work and it took me way too long to write the script. On the other hand, TI users will take longer to take action because they want to make sure that they are more accurate with fixing a problem or to be the most optimal when working on a system. This is the reason why TE users tend to produce more than the TI counterpart, because TE's primary focus is on speed and efficiency, whereas TI's primary focus is on accuracy and optimization. So if a high TE user and a high TI user both decides to create a YouTube channel, the high TE user is more likely to start a channel and optimize as we go, whereas the high TI user will focus more on perfecting their first video and will take longer to start. Remember when I say that TE sees a bunch of interconnected systems? TI is able to see the systems as well, but there's a difference in focus. And the difference is that TI focuses on the details as to why a system works, leading to narrowing the focus to only a few systems at a time. Whereas extroverted thinking usually focuses on the output the system produces and how it affects interconnected systems, focusing on more systems at once. And don't forget, systems aren't stagnant. They're constantly evolving. So the vision of TI is more narrow and precise, whereas the vision of TE is less precise and more expansive. Knowing the difference in how TE affects the user is what leads to the bossy stereotype. High TE users can easily tell if something or someone will become a problem and will want to fix it as soon as possible. Whereas low TE or TI users usually don't want to fix a problem until fixing the problem is absolutely necessary or once they feel like it. The question isn't whether there's something that needs to be fixed, it's a question of when the thing will get fixed. High TE user will think everyone is lazy and everyone else will think the high TE user is bossy. Admittedly, sometimes high TE users see something as a problem that most people don't even consider as a problem, so there is an issue of vision as well. So to summarize this portion, extroverted thinking and introverted thinking are both based on systems, data, and logic. They could both see what the other type is seeing, but their focus is just on different parts of the system. I'm going to quickly go over the similarity between extroverted thinking and extroverted feeling, because I personally believe that they are very similar. Similar to extroverted thinking, high FE users tend to always have an opinion on everything, typically people focused, leading to the gossip stereotype. TE notices systems and focuses on a sensory method of influence, whereas FE notices systems and focuses on the emotional aspect of influence. So they're doing the same thing, just two different approaches. Both TE and FE understand systems and emotions so well, their thought is always, if you follow these steps, you will succeed. So they both come off as bossy in their own separate way. They're both extremely good at listening and respect genuine feedback, because their primary focus is to improve the life of those they care about. Therefore, receiving genuine feedback is valued. It might not seem like they're listening, but most of the time, they just need to figure out where it belongs in the system. The last commonality between these two is the same expectation of a united vision. And I'm using the term vision lightly because it's probably not the best word, but I can't think of anything better at this time. They both won't feel good until the person that they're engaging with or the tribe has a shared sense of vision. They want everyone to be on the same page. TE and FE both believe that what they're saying is the best option and will constantly engage or remind their loved ones of what the vision is to ensure that they're following it as well. This vision is the reason why FE Doms will tell you to forgive someone, even if the other person is 100% guilty or at the wrong, because they want harmony. And this vision is the reason why a TE Dom will try to fix something of yours, even when you specifically told them not to touch it because they have an urge to fix your problem. The approach might be unwanted or harsh, but it does come from a good place. So this is me defending the TE and FE Doms. All right, guys, let's talk about how TE manifests in TE users now. And we're going to start off with low TE users and make our way up. It manifests in a few different ways. The first is the easiest to see because it's a stereotype of a TE user. It's when the TE user creates a self-imposed sense of urgency, which is different from poor planning or procrastination, because poor planning or procrastination is not unique to TE users. So it's not fully correct to say that having low TE causes these two traits. What I'm talking about instead is when a low TE user, out of the blue, decides something needs to happen and it needs to happen right now, even if that thing has no time constraint or if there's still plenty of time to complete whatever the project is. There's this sudden sense of urgency, and because TE is an extroverted function, that means that urgency is usually projected to those around us. And as mentioned earlier, extroverted thinking wants everyone to be on the same page. So low TE users tend to be more forceful when this happens. This behavior is easily noticed when it comes down to planning. The low TE user would say something along the lines of, we have to do this right now, or if we don't leave right now, we're going to miss whatever we have planned after this. The reason why the group doesn't feel the same sense of urgency is because we all have access to the same data set. We're all aware of the situation and know that we have plenty of time before action needs to happen. We're going to make it in time even if we take our time. I do want to add that sometimes low TE users are correct. So it's wrong to say low TE users are always overreacting when these moments happen, because sometimes they are absolutely right. We need to leave right now. I also want to add that each type has extroverted thinking somewhere in the 8 stacks, so everyone would do this sometimes. As with most things in MBTI, it's the frequency and the reason behind why it happens that matters, and not the simple fact that it actually happens. I recently witnessed a random lady who missed the last ferry ride home. She kept asking the ticket counter person questions about the validity of the data source, hoping to get an answer. But the website said this and you're saying this. Now how am I supposed to get home? It's a shitty situation to be in. I felt bad for both parties, for that lady and for the ticket counter person, because the ticket counter person doesn't have to answer. But the difference between a low TE user and a high TE user is that the high TE user won't spend much time being upset at the situation until the problem is fixed. So most of the initial reaction is figuring out how to fix the problem, and then once it's fixed, then we could be upset. So it's different order of operation. High TE users will immediately go to problem solving mode and then get upset once the problem is solved. Low TE users will take longer to go to problem solving mode and will usually be upset throughout the entire time. High TE users won't waste our time on things that we have no control over and will consider all interconnected systems to figure out the next best plan forward. The second noteworthy attitude of a low TE user is the lack of critical thinking around the system. I know this section is going to sound harsh, so I apologize if it upsets your feeling, but I'm not going to apologize for speaking the truth. This is how low TE users look to high TE users. We've already established that the main superpower of a TE user is the ability to see and understand interconnected systems. I also mentioned that TE tends to outsource the responsibility of in-depth investigation so that we can produce more output comparatively to our TI counterpart. Therefore, a low TE user tend to have a lesser understanding of systems and more open to outsource in-depth investigation. Understanding that is huge, because when you learn to see it, you can easily eliminate half of the 16 MBTI types when you're typing someone. So let me repeat myself. A low TE user tends to have a lesser understanding of a system and more open to outsource in-depth investigation. It's difficult to notice unless questions are being asked, because don't forget, TE is about efficiency. Why say more than is necessary if we can prove the same point using less words? But once the person is pressed on the validity or knowledge of their data set, you can easily see the difference, because a high TE user will be able to understand how a system is valid in regards to its data points and the validity to it compared to other interconnected systems. Low TE users have a more difficult time explaining that. Let's start off talking about prestige. And this is applicable to all low thinking users and not just TE or TI users. It's when a person believes that a certain system is as prestige as it is without doing their own set of research. In layman's term, it's when people reference shit without understanding what they're referencing and accept this as truth. You see this all the time from other MBTI content creators. It's when a content creator believes that a celebrity or a famous person is a certain type because a prestige MBTI system or content creator says so. And when you start questioning that content creator who put out that video or says that, instead of explaining their own thought process and how they arrived to that conclusion of that person's type, they just say it's because this other system says it because they have the prestige. They just believe it. Technically, this isn't a bad approach, nor am I saying that high thinking users don't do this, because high TE users do fall into this trap because we love to outsource. The difference is the level of frequency at which it happens and the level of data source required for whatever situation we're in. We will only do it when we don't care about it. Low or underdeveloped thinking users tend to do this more often than high thinking users. And when they're back into a corner having to explain their reasoning, their fight or flight response is something similar to, because Stone Cold said so. High thinking users either understand a system really well or can thoroughly explain how this system affects connecting systems if they believe strongly in their stance. But if they don't care about it, they don't care about it. Another way it manifests in real life is when a low TE user name drops a scientist, news article, or a study in order to prove their point without actually understanding what's being referenced. The low TE user don't fully understand the data or the implication of the data set. They'll just say something along the lines of, this New York Times article said they performed a study, and it's the New York Times, and their name is popular, so it must be true because they're credible. They have the prestige. High-thinking users don't operate the same way. We might agree that the article is interesting and that we heard of the New York Times, but we have to read the article to understand it ourselves and tie it back to all the systems that we're aware of. There's a level of critical thinking that allows the high TE user to see how the study connects to other systems that low TE users don't usually see. And there's always a level of scrutiny a high TE user has questioning the accuracy of the data source. Don't forget that the thinking function is all about logic. So the accuracy of the data matters because it affects the rest of the system it's connected to. Low TE users fall into this trap all the time. This one article says this, so it must be true. And the response from the high TE user will be, are there other sources that says the same thing? What's the credibility of all the sources being used? It all comes down to how accurate the data source is and how it can be applied to the system as a whole or all interconnecting systems. The last thing that I want to add in this section is that low TE users tend to have this affinity to be in a position to provide help to other people, to recognize structures or help structure their systems. A lot of them want to be life coaches, counselors, or some type of mentorship position. What it seems like to me is that they're so proud of finally finding the key to being successful because now they can see all the systems. So they want to help prevent other people from going through the hardship that they went through, which honestly is very admirable. And I'm not going to shit on someone trying to improve other people's lives. But sometimes they're not the best person to be providing mentorship. Sometimes they don't have their own shit together. And don't forget that high TE leads from the front as a person that shows what's capable as an example. And tying this back to the difference between high TE user is that high TE users naturally become mentors. Most of the time we don't even seek it. It just falls into our lap. I'm not saying it's not okay to provide advice even if you're still going through hardship or if you're in a slump. But there's a difference between providing advice and becoming a mentor. But that's just my own stance on this. You can think however you want. The final portion of this video is to compare and contrast, because everything about extroverted thinking that I think is important to discuss will have been discussed after this portion. It's the dominant TE users, ESTJ and ENTJ, versus the secondary TE users, the ISTJ and INTJs. I'm also an INTJ, so this is the best way I can describe the difference. Since extroverted thinking's focus are on logical systems, that means that most of their time is focused on climbing this already established, socially established mountain. So it's been predefined by society that this mountain should be climbable and that climbing this will lead to success. But for the ISTJ and INTJ, who has introverted feeling in our third slot, climbing the highest mountain isn't our priority. We just want to get to a point where FI is like, guys, this is high enough. And then we improve all the systems that are around us at that point. But for TE DOMs, climbing to the top of the mountain is the priority. So they won't stop until the mountain is summited. And then they'll look for another mountain to climb until FI tells them to stop. The biggest difference between a TE DOM compared to a TE secondary user isn't our ability to accomplish insurmountable tasks, because we'll all get it done if it needs to get done. The primary difference is at what point we decide it's time to stop. An extremely simplified way of describing this is if all TE users were running a race. TE in the fourth slot, the ISFP and INFP, will say that a 5K is enough. TE in the third slot, the ESFP and ENFPs, will say that a 10K is enough. TE in the second slot, the ISTJs and the INTJs, will say that a half marathon is enough. But the dominant TE users, the ESTJ and ENTJ, will say that they're doing the entire marathon and maybe even more. Low TE users tend to take a more lackadaisical approach to TE problems, and high TE users tend to be overachievers. But even having TE as my second function, I also feel that TE DOMs are doing way too much. How that difference manifests is that ISTJ and INTJs are more loose word are structured plans, whereas the ESTJ and ENTJs will be more likely to follow through with the structured plan. The easiest way to explain the difference internally is that for TE secondary users, TE is mama. Mama TE will bust into our rooms if we're being lazy, doing NI or SI shit, and will constantly nag us to get stuff done that we know will get done and we're too lazy to do it. She won't stop nagging us until it's done, but we appreciate her because she gets us places. Whereas for the TE DOMs, they're mama. They're the ones busting into the door, telling everyone to wake up and start working on stuff. But their secondary function of introverted intuition and introverted sensing is their spouse reminding them that they need to chill. Externally, it's difficult to tell the difference. Even as a high TE user, I usually can't tell the difference between the four of us when working on a task until we actually have time to communicate our thought process. And saying that it's easy to tell because NI users tend to use new method, whereas SI users tend to use old and proven method isn't true if there's an immediate time constraint to the problem. If the problem needs to get fixed immediately, then you always go with the tried and true. Fix now, think later. While communicating or conversing, high TE users tend to be more forceful with recommendations because don't forget, they want everyone to be on the same page. Whereas secondary TE users tend to have a more use it or lose it approach. We'll tell you how to fix a problem or how to improve it yourself, but it's up to you whether you listen or not. Dominant TE users will typically follow up, sometimes consistently, ensuring that you're following the system that they created for you because they understand how that system will unlock other system that was previously locked for you if you were to follow their systems. Whereas for secondary TE users, we'll pop in from time to time to see how you're doing and your progress, and we'll be annoyed but not forceful when we find out that you stop following the system we created for you. It's your life. You do what you want to do and what makes the most sense to you. But you forfeited your right to complain if we created a system for you and you're not going to follow it. Speaking of creating structure, dominant TE users tend to make everything into a project or something to fix, whereas secondary TE users will default to our dominant cognitive function. If you tell a dominant TE user that you're sick, they're more than happy to provide recommendations on how to get better or how to prevent it from happening again. Whereas for the secondary TE users, we may provide those answers as well, but it's our secondary thought process because it's our secondary function. Our first function is perceiving. Typically, our first thought is, why are you sick? And then the recommendation comes afterward. TE DOMs will start off with the recommendation most of the time before they even know what the problem is. And then we would have to stop them like, bro, you don't even know why they're sick. Another noticeable difference is how FI manifests itself. It's easier to tell if you've crossed the FI line for a secondary TE user compared to a dominant TE user. The ISTJ and INTJ will have no problem speaking up if we believe you're being unethical, and the volume in which you will understand how unethical you are will be loud and precise. You will know where and how you fucked up. As a result, the secondary TE user, in addition to having an introverted dominant function, are less likely to be forgiving. You'll see the emotional side of the ISTJ and INTJ easier than the other two because we're more comfortable showing it to the people that we trust. But we're more hurt when trust is broken because FI is our third function. Emotion is less escapable for us. TE DOMs tend to be more forgiving comparatively since FI is in their fourth slot. They can't ignore it better than we can. But this also leads to a lesser ability to see a person's true character. Sometimes the TE DOMs associate a person's value to the system to be the same as that person's own FI value, which isn't always the case. Also, in regards to FI, TE DOMs are less aware that their FI is showing or that they're showing emotions. They also tend to power through negative emotions because they won't have time to focus on it if they're busy working on a project. Secondary TE users, we have the same mentality, but we succumb to our emotions sooner than that of the TE DOM. But don't forget, this only applies to people that we're close to. We're not going to show it to strangers. The most notable difference between a dominant TE or secondary TE user is what we're willing to budge on. Your dominant function is your superpower. It's where you live and breathe, and you're aware that there are very few people out there that's better than you at using it. Since extroverted thinking is the dominant function for the ESTJ and ENTJ, they're less likely to consider or adopt another person's system, similar to the INTJ not budging on our plans or the ISTJ resistance to change. TE DOMs are less likely to incorporate another system that they haven't had the time or opportunity to validate its data source and accuracy. So if you tell a secondary TE user to change up the system that we're using to improve, we'll be more open to considering it or changing it if it's more effective. TE DOMs will be more resistant and will have a natural urge to deflect that recommendation. but they will change it if they consider the source of a recommendation to have its validity. So in a nutshell, to conclude this entire video, extroverted thinking is a tribe-driven logical function that ingests data and can naturally prove its validity by understanding its data source and how it connects with all other systems. Those systems are then used to affect the sensory world to improve not only the systems itself, but also the lives of those within the FI value of the TE DOM, which is a system in itself. High TE users don't fear conflict because accurate data trumps feelings and believe that a person can improve their lives by seeing the world similar to that of the dominant TE user, which is you have to understand and master all infinite sources of interconnected systems if you want to be effective at being successful. And that's all for this video, folks. It took me weeks to come up with this script because most of my videos have some type of FI or feeling involved to it, but thinking doesn't really have emotions. So it was very difficult for me to write this because it didn't really feel right to write a video that didn't have emotions. So yeah, thanks for watching. I really do appreciate it. Thank you. Bye.